Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to be going over the Tal Caro-Kann, which is in my opinion the trickiest variation black could face in my favorite opening. And I'm going to try and explain why you lose against the Tal Caro-Kann and how to keep the position safe, secure, and slightly better for black. Now, I myself have faced this numerous times, lost many games, won some games, but I've always struggled with it and I was never happy to see it over the board. I'm also going to show you two ideas that I use to win some games that are kind of offbeat. Okay, so the Tal Caro-Kann is h4 in the advance. So after e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, the advance variation, black plays bishop f5. And white plays this advancing move h4. Now, what does h4 mean? Why is the Tal variation so tricky? Well, first of all, black is in danger here if black continues the normal advanced Caro-Kann way. If you play e6, then g4 wins your bishop. So h4 actually threatens to win a piece, because if bishop g6 now, then h5 picks the bishop up and it's over. So black has to react. Black doesn't have time for e6, which is a move black has to play in order to develop the rest of their pieces. Black would like to move the bishop, maybe play knight e7 and so on. So black has two main ways to react. I should mention that h5 is by far the most common move. But we're also going to be looking at pawn to h6, which is my favorite way to deal with this. My success rate is 50%, although the game I lost against a 2300 plus FIDE master, a young FIDE master from Slovakia, and I was better at some point. So it wasn't because of the opening. It was because I messed up the late middle game. So we're going to be looking at two ways to deal with this. Now, h5 is the most popular way and probably the principled way to fight this. And white has two different ideas against this. Now, I'm going to be dividing this video into three chapters. The first two chapters are going to be c4 and bishop d3 here, which are the two main moves. And I'm going to explain a bit about them in this introductory part. So c4 is definitely the less aggressive way to play. And I think after c4, black is perfectly fine. Now, black could continue e6, normal development, but black also has the opportunity to take on c4 straight away, give white a tempo, so to speak, to develop the bishop. But after e6, the d4 pawn is going to be permanently weak. And I played one game in Limone in Italy against the 2100, 2050, something like that, where he ended up playing knight f3 pretty early on. And I simply played bishop g4, which is a pattern I would like you to remember. Getting rid of the defender of the d4 pawn, ended up rounding up that pawn and winning the game. So against c4, I will advise you to simply take straight away, even though that's not the main move. The main move is e6. Now, after h5, more commonly bishop d3 is played, and this is far more venomous. Bishop d3 is a very aggressive move because it gets rid of your control over the light squares, which means that any advance of this pawn can be deadly because it will undermine your light squares completely. So for example, after queen d3, if you don't go e6 now, if you play a random move like here, and then this happens, you can see that it's game over. So that's the main idea behind bishop d3, and you have to be careful. So after bishop d3 takes e6, usually white will continue bishop g5. And now we're going to be looking at three alternatives for black. One of them is going to be queen b6, which is the main line stuff, crazy complications. But I am going to be showing you a line in which black is slightly better, and it's all pretty much forced. Although I have seen black lose that line more times than I've seen black be successful, because it's extremely hard to navigate. The alternative to queen b6, the tricky main lines, are going to be bishop e7 passive lines, which I sometimes play. I like them. They are far less dangerous for black. This is the tame way to play. And then finally, the cowardly way to play is queen a5, although it's not easy at all. The idea behind queen a5 is that you eventually would like to trade queens with queen a6, and white is, if they know what they're doing, going to be declining that. So against bishop to d3, we're going to be looking at 3 ways for black to play, and they're all fine. Now, the final position I would like to address is pawn to h6, which is completely different to the move h5, because it keeps control over the g5 square. And as we're going to see in many lines where black plays h5, gives up the g5 square, it's going to be extremely easy for white to gain control over that square, put a knight in, put a bishop in, and cause trouble on the king side. Okay, before we get into the theory, I would like to thank the sponsor of today's video, Chess Titans. Chess Titans is more than chess. How many times have you imagined playing chess with different pieces that have powers or even superpowers? Well, Chess Titans enables you to do that. You choose your team, you replace your existing chess pieces, like for a pawn, I'm going to be using a mimic. A mimic is a piece that moves differently to a pawn and captures horizontally. Once it captures a piece, it can become that piece from your opponent's team. Now, for a rook, I'm using a battering ram. It's pretty similar to a rook, except for one thing. Once per game, it can capture 2 pieces that are lined up on the same file. Now, to me, that could be kind of confusing, having so many pieces, but you unlock them one by one, you get acquainted with them one by one, you choose your team and you get accustomed to the different pieces. Now, when you get paired against different players, they don't have to have the same pieces as you, and that's the fun part. Now, maybe you're a better chess player, but they have better pieces, so prove that your actual chess skill can beat their, superior armies, let's put it that way. Now, Chess Titans can actually improve your chess because you get to develop critical thinking and creative thinking in a very different way. Now, for example, my king in the game I'm about to show you, I'm going to be using the monarch. Now, the monarch is pretty similar to the king, but it can evolve and then get additional squares. It can move to additional squares it can move. So instead of 1 square, it can move 2 squares. So an example game. Now I'm going to be opening up my battering ram and capturing 2 of my opponent's pieces at once. Okay, so imagine having so many options, having so many possibilities with so many different pieces. That's what makes Chess Titans fun. Now, I enjoyed the game. I think it's fun. It's not chess, it's more than chess, and it's different. But I really look forward to getting all the different pieces. Now, you can unlock them as you play, as you get better, as you gain elo, but you can also buy them for gems in the App Store. And if you want to, search in the Apple Store or Google Play Store to find Chess Titans, or use the link you can see in the description below and visit Chess Titans and download the app. I think it's great, I think it's fun, and please let me know in the comments what you think about it. Thank you very much. Let's go back to the video. Okay, let's start with pawn to c4 by white. So we're looking at e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, bishop f5, h4, h5, c4. Okay, so the Tal variation is aimed at causing discomfort on the king side. And in my opinion, if white plays c4 and black has not played c5, we can try to play against the pawn on d4 and sort of leave our king side unattended and disregard the weaknesses. So my recommendation against the c4 Tal Caro-Kann is to take on c4. Before we look into that, I'm going to briefly show you the main lines. The main lines go e6, knight c3, knight e7, knight g2, the knight is coming to g3, or knight c3, knight e7, knight g2. And now we can take on c4 again, but white gets the pawn back. If we take on c4 now, then knight g3, bishop g6 and bishop c4. When your bishop is on f5 and they go knight g3, you never give that bishop up. You always go bishop g6. So for example, something like this, bishop g6, bishop c4. We lost the tempo again, but it's not as clean. Something like bishop g5, queen b6 is okay. So eventually taking on c4 is preferable in my opinion, but you don't have to. You can go knight d7 when they go knight g3, bishop g6. Then white may be able to take on d5, we're going to take with the knight, and once this trade happens, we now have a sort of improved French because our bishop is not on c8. However, we do not have control over g5, and that square is easy for white to occupy. Now, you should always be careful about playing f6, especially if your king is still on e8. There's a game I played in Graz last year where I played f6 too early in this exact variation, and I got destroyed. Okay, so this structure is fine. Just don't go risking it all with f6 too early. However, instead of the main lines, I will recommend the move dc4, and this is just the simplest way to play. There have been around 80 master games from this position, and funnily enough, the engine gives this as slightly better for black or equal in most lines. Okay, white takes. And now we go e6. Now that we've clarified the situation, now that we know that cd5 isn't a possibility, now that we've created this backwards d pawn, now we continue with our own strategy. Our strategy will be to get the knight to f5, to get our major pieces on the d file, probably castle queenside, maybe get this knight into d5, if we can recapture with a major piece, and start putting pressure on d4. So for example, knight c3, knight d7. I should mention that knight f3 in most cases is a mistake, and white should continue knight g2. If they go knight f3, play bishop g4 straight away. And now white has a rough time dealing with this position. We're basically threatening knight b6, bishop f3, and queen d4 if white does nothing. So white's best is probably to go bishop e2. Okay, and now you don't take on f3, giving up the bishop pair for nothing. You're going to wait for this knight to move, because the knight moving away undefends d4 anyway. So for example, knight e7, knight g5, now we trade, and go knight f5, and you can see that there's this annoying pressure on d4, which white has to deal with. So the knight basically has to retreat. We can now go knight b6, get the knight into d5, exactly what I was talking about. Play bishop e7, putting pressure on h4. So you have two weaknesses to target. So any knight f3 is a mistake. Knight g2 should be played, because now it's not that easy to pin the knight. Any bishop g4 is met with f3. We go knight b6, they retreat the bishop somewhere, probably b3, but d3 isn't too bad, I believe. Bishop e7, putting pressure on the pawn, knight g3. Now again, you never win this pawn if they can take your bishop on f5. If you play bishop h4, then knight f5, ef5 is always bad. Whenever your e-pawn disappears, you're worse. You don't even have to think about it. Something like g3, bishop g5, or bishop e7, you lose the pawn anyway, rook h5. So whenever they go knight g3, you bring your bishop back. Okay, they will go something like bishop e3, knight h6. You're not afraid of losing this pawn. If knight h5, you go knight f5. And now if knight f4, you can go rook h4. So that's fine. You basically want this structure where there's constant annoying pressure on d4 and h4. You want that structure. And ideally, you'd like to castle queenside. Of course, it's not without its risks. This could happen, but it's a playable position where you have a weakness to target. And if you turned on the engine, it's going to say 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So, in short, c4, just take it. Target d4, hope for knight f3, and go knight h6, knight f5, or knight e7, knight f5. Now, bishop d3 is far more tricky. So the same position with bishop d3, as I said, aims to get rid of your light squared presence as quickly as possible. You have to take this. You don't have an alternative. If bishop g4, then f3. If bishop g6, then takes. So just take and go e6. Okay. Now bishop g5 is the main move, but they could go knight f3. It's most likely going to transpose. Most likely, but let's look at bishop g5. Now, let's look at the tricky main lines first. So queen b6. Now, queen b6 is a logical move. Your queen's attacked and the b2 pawn is undefended. So, okay, that's the most common move. In this position, white plays knight d2. If white plays knight c3, black is slightly better. And the reason for that is that after c5, which you're going to play against knight d2 as well, white does not have c4 breaking your center. The main downside of c5 in the advanced Caro-Kann is c4 undermining the d5 pawn and the e6 pawn, where you no longer have a defense coming from the queen side. So if knight c3, c5 comes without a downside, and white really should take. And now bishop c5. Knight a4, of course, doesn't work because of bishop f2, and black is slightly better, without any issues at all. After knight d7, white's position is close to collapsing. So after queen b6, knight d2. Okay, we go c5 anyway, and now the point of leaving the c2 pawn free to move is c4, the only move for white. Any other move, again, black is slightly better. Okay, now comes the crazy part. We're going to be a couple pawns up, but our position is going to be extremely hard to play. We are going to have fewer developed pieces than white. We're going to have a less safe king, and we're going to be struggling to not lose the game in a single move to a tactical blunder. So if you're willing to go into that, by all means, learn this variation. I myself have always been too scared to go into this against a stronger opponent. So here's the line. If you learn it though, and if you learn possible mistakes white could make, you're going to be better. So we take the pawn. Now, white does not play rook b1. Rook b1 is a bad move. If rook b1, queen d4, and black is better. Something like queen e2, b6, and we're fine. I shouldn't even say that this is also fine for us. It's perfectly fine. So against queen b2, rook d1. The idea is a ton of pressure down the d file. You can see that if the center disappears, black's going to be in trouble. Black's king is completely naked. Now we continue knight c6, connecting our pieces, defending d8. And white's a pawn down, but white doesn't worry about that too much. Knight gf3, and now knight b4, the only good move. Anything else is better for white. The queen moves away, c takes d4, 2 pawns, okay? White castles, doesn't care about the pawns. Now compare the piece activity, compare the king safety. We have 2 pawns, but if we make a mistake, we're going to lose the knight on b4, we're going to lose the queen, we're going to get mated. So just try to keep things closed. The best move here is d3, saving your pawn, chasing the queen away some more and gaining some time, and also opening our queen up to e5. Okay, queen e3, and now queen a3. It's time to run away because rook b1 is coming. Okay. And also we defend the pawn. So rook b1 anyway, and now we finally start developing knight h6. Now, white really should take that knight. If white doesn't take that knight, probably rook b3 is a fine move, where we take on a2. Knight d4 is already better for black, and much better. So bishop h6 is the best move, and now we take with the g pawn. Don't be confused by this. We don't want to allow the knight into g5. And our plan is going to be bishop g7 and castles kingside, however crazy that may seem. So rook b3, we take on a2, okay, another pawn. C takes d5, knight takes d5, always knight takes d5. If you take with the e pawn, you're losing. Queen takes d3, and now let's count. White has 4 pawns, black has 6 pawns. Queen a6, offering a queen trade. We would love a queen trade. Queen b1. And now we just leave this pawn. We don't have time to save the pawn. That would be too much. Bishop g7, rook b7, and castles. And if you learn all of this, if white plays the way you want them to play by doing what's best for their position, you're going to reach a position like this, which is slightly better for black. Black is a pawn ahead. Black has a passed a pawn, which is huge if you trade the major pieces, and the endgame is much better for black. The bishop on g7 is good. The knight on d5 is amazing. However, the problem is there are so many deviations white could play, which is what makes the Tal variation with bishop d3 extremely hard to navigate. So, for example, in this position, queen e2 is the only good move. Queen b3 is losing. Queen b1 is losing because it trades queens. However, after, let's say, d3, queen e3 is the only good move. Queen e1 is losing for white. But why? Why? Well, the reason is you go knight c2. This one is, again, easy to understand. What if in this position, after knight c6, they don't go knight gf3. What if they go knight e2? What's the difference? This is the stuff you'll have to understand. Now, after knight b4, there's no queen e2, but there's queen f3. Again, a good move. Knight c2 check is fine for white after king f1, and then knight takes d4. So stuff like this, you're going to have to learn by yourself. There are so many good, bad moves for white, which you need to know in order to either not lose too much time or not lose the position if you want to play this position well. So again, after bishop g5 and the bishop d3 main lines of the Tal Caro-Kann, queen b6 is the riskiest move you can play. Now, the first alternative is bishop e7. This is, as I said, the tame way to play, and it's not crazy at all. It's going to be roughly equal because the Tal variation of the Caro-Kann is not the main line. It doesn't give white a forced advantage, but white is going to have a pleasant position. You're not causing any trouble. So knight f3, knight h6, knight c3, knight f5, something like knight e2, trying to challenge your knight. You really should play c5 at some point. dc5, queen a5, c3 takes, and then knight d4. And again, should be about equal. As I said, I did play this in some games, but I was never really happy with my position. I don't really know what to play for. It's too equal for my taste. So I'm not going to say that this is a good way to play for a draw, because it's not. It's not an easy position to navigate. So the pros of this position is that you avoid all the complications and all the main lines. So if you're playing a booked up opponent, do this. And alternatively, the line that I actually like is queen a5. This is what I would recommend you to play. Even though white has a bigger advantage in this line than in the other two, I think it's harder for white to navigate than for black. And after knight d2, again, knight c3 is not a good move because of queen a6 and you don't have c4. So after knight d2, queen a6, c4, you go bishop b4. Try to pin the knight, try to win the pawn, force b3, and now you simply continue developing. Knight d7, they will go knight f3, you will go knight e7, they will castle. Okay, knight f5, good knight on f5, good bishop, good queen, everything seems fine. Let's say rook f to d1. And in this position I prefer taking the knight. You couldn't really call this theory, but this is my prep and my analysis, and I found that this move works really well. And with castles, I never got into trouble when I was training in this position against a very strong engine. It was really hard to lose this. My knights are great. The h5 pawn is relatively secure. Their bishop on g5 is staring at nothing. I think a4 should be the best attempt, and then just any rook to c8. I prefer rook f c8 with the idea of rook c7 and rook c8 and trying to do something with b6, c5. You definitely have a plan here. If they go c5 closing the position down, then definitely b6. If they go b4, then you take on c4 target d4. If they go a5, you go b6. So you have all the cards on the queen side, I believe. And there isn't much going on the king side. So that's why I like queen a5. So again, in this position, choose between crazy main lines, equal position, or queen a5, which is better for white according to the engine, but I think very easy for black to play. Okay, now, avoiding all of that, if you would like to avoid all of that, this is the way I play now. I go h6. And h6 may seem crazy, but it's actually a good attempt, and it's completely equal. Now, white should go g4. If white doesn't go g4, then, I mean, why do you go h4? Then h4 is just a weakness because you're not controlling g5. So if white continues with something like knight f3, then just go e6 and you're better. Okay, so they go g4. Now, there are two ways to play this. I always go bishop e4, but I'm going to show you how to get into a French. So if you go bishop d7 and they go h5 and you go e6, this is a French defense with the bishop on d7, which means that you have to go c5. Very, very similar to the bayonet attack. They will go something like f4, you'll go c5, c3, maybe queen b6, knight f3, knight c6, and this position is okay if you like the French. I don't, so I don't want to play this. we're playing the Caro-Kann for a reason, and that reason is to have a good bishop. So we go bishop e4, provoking further weaknesses. They go f3, we go bishop h7, and in this position, e6 is the best move. I faced h5 once against that FIDE master in Graz, and I lost the game, but again, I was slightly better at some point. At some point, I even had a -2 position, but I didn't know why, so that doesn't really matter. But this is not the correct way to play. The correct way to play is e6. Now, this is a common pattern. When your bishop disappears from this diagonal, e6 should always be played by white and should never be taken by black. If you take this, this is a bad position. Bishop d3, takes, takes, and you can see that your light squares are gone. If you want to get mated in one, play knight d7, sign the score sheets, and go home. But even if you don't blunder mate, it's extremely hard to play. Extremely hard to play. So, against e6, we go queen d6, allowing e takes f7, misplacing our king. So they take. We take with the king. And now there are two main moves, f4 and bishop d3. I faced bishop d3 in the first game I played this. This is the game Gargantov-Tomic from the 2022 European Amateur Championship, last round, round 9. One of my favorite tournaments, and I scored extremely well in that one, and I won this game. Now, the point behind all of this for black is to push e5 immediately. Therefore, f4 is more common than bishop d3, preventing e5 by force. Against bishop d3, you play e5. And of course, they can misplace your rook too, but it doesn't really matter. The game went bishop h7, rook h7, knight e2, knight d7, supporting e5, knight bc3, queen d3, knight gf6, queen d3, and rook e8. And look at the harmony in the black position. So my opponent played bishop e3. I should say that my opponent was about 2100 at the time, I'm not sure. And he was spending a ton of time. He wasn't familiar with the variation. But this is actually a sound way to play. We're still following a game played between two Croatian grandmasters, Zoran Jovanovic and Robert Zelčić, where black had won too. So I took on d4. He took with the bishop, I played knight e5. And this basically forces bishop takes, because everything else loses, either the queen or the f3 pawn. And queen f5 is extremely risky. So he took. I took with the queen, he castled queenside, then we got this endgame, which was roughly equal, but I ended up winning. You can see that the full game in the Road to GM series. So bishop d3 is okay, but I believe that if black manages to play e5, black's position is great. So f4. That's what I would recommend for white. And now as black, we go knight f6. We sort of threaten to take the pawn on g4. And white can defend it or leave it undefended, but win it later. I think bishop h3 is unnecessary. If bishop h3 defending the pawn, then simply c5. And white should continue g5, h takes, and now I like the move bishop e4. This is my prep for that game in 2022. Rook h2, and now I was going to play this. I was going to go knight c6. This is an engine line which is equal, but extremely easy for black to play. You give up a piece, they play gf6, you go ef6, and now, well, I was thinking knight c3. If dc5, then queen c5, and the knight is under pressure. So king f1 is forced, and then we continue, I don't know, rook e8, just a normal position. So when I was preparing, I thought that knight c3 would be the soundest response here. Then cd4, knight e4, d4, and this is what I was hoping to get. Two pawns in the center, passed pawn down the e-file that can be defended with g6, f5, get your rook to e8, and this seemed very, very pleasant to me. The engine says equal, but okay. So that's bishop h3. Now knight f3 is better, and you should take the pawn, but be aware that it's not an extra pawn, you're going to lose it back. After bishop h3, h5, and now knight e5 check. And if you take that knight, you're losing because of the two pawns in the center. If knight e5, f e5, queen g6, something like bishop e3, and black is completely busted, these two bishops are monsters. Your pieces are not developed. Your knight doesn't have squares. Your bishops are dead completely. Your rook is dead. Your king is absurd on f7 and everything is wide open. So don't do that. Don't take the knight. After knight e5 check, you go king e8. Okay, they're going to take on g4, hg4, queen g4, and this should be about equal. The engine says plus 0.3. After bishop e4, I mean, you can see that there is some activity and some connection between the black pieces. This knight can challenge the knight on e5, not to take it, but to go knight f6. And it's, again, relatively pleasant. So, in short, h5 are the main lines. If they go c4, you shouldn't worry about it too much. If they go bishop d3, you need to have one of the three variations prepared. If you want to avoid the main lines, go h6 and play what I play, which I think is extremely pleasant. So the Tal variation should no longer be a problem for you. I hope I equipped you with all the weapons you need. Thank you very much for watching, guys. Please let me know what you think in the comments below and stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.